If you have a group of 100 depressed human beings and you give them Prozac, maybe 60% on checklists will report some improvement. And you give the same people or similar people a sugar pill, tell them that it's an antidepressant or it might be an antidepressant, then 40, 50% will check off that they're feeling better. So the margin between what people get from just being told they're getting something good and actually getting an active drug is maybe 5%, 10%. It's very marginal. Now, why does that margin even exist? Well, it's the snake oil effect. When you take a sugar pill, you don't get a stomachache or a headache. You don't get sweaty. You don't get nightmares. You don't have insomnia. But you can get all that from taking an antidepressant, so you know something's happening to you. It's like when I get a stomachache, if I take an antibiotic and I get a stomachache, I think, boy, if it's doing that to my stomach, what's it doing to those bacteria? All right? Doesn't make any sense, of course. Well, people, when they get adverse effects from the drugs, A, they know they're on the drug rather than the sugar pill. B, the doctor knows they're on the drug rather than on the sugar pill. And they get more hope from having something happening in their body. And that accounts for that very small difference between the sugar pill and the active drug. And even that's been figured out, because if you give a person a placebo that has side effects, but it's not an antidepressant, let's say you give them some of the drugs we use for gut problems, like atropine, and their eyes get bigger, and pupils get bigger, and they get dry mouth. They know they got a drug. Maybe they get constipated. Then they do as well on the active control, the one with side effects, as on the drug. It's all hocus pocus. Billions of dollars worth of hocus pocus. And I go into this in excruciatingly painful detail in some of my books, like Talking Back to Prozac, where I look at all the hocus pocus. So, in short, placebos open a pill. Now, when the placebo effect is put on Time magazine or Newsweek, they give them make Prozac pill of the year, and the whole culture's telling you these pills work, you have a super duper cultural placebo every time you take the drug. But the darn thing is that nonetheless, these drugs are so crappy, they're so ineffective, and they give so many adverse effects that even when they try to do studies, the drug companies can't get enough people to stay on them past 4 or 5 weeks to do a long-term study. They literally can't even do long-term studies. We do know from long-term animal studies that these drugs permanently change the brain. The brain does not like Prozac. It doesn't like Paxil. It thinks they're toxins. One of the first things that was noticed about Prozac was that it had amphetamine or cocaine-like effects on some people, that it caused overstimulation. People would lose weight, just like on speed. They would get extra energy, just like on speed. They'd get agitated, they'd get anxious. And the first person to really notice this in detail was Richard Capit, K-A-P-I-T, who was the FDA's chief in charge of adverse effects for Prozac when it was being developed. So all the adverse effects that the company collected were sent to the FDA, and Capit looked at them. And he said to the FDA, we're going to make some depressed patients worse. He wrote this down in memos. I quote them in Talking Back to Prozac. He said, we're going to make some patients worse because instead of just being depressed, they're going to be agitated and anxious. And he compared it to amphetamine. So this was known from the beginning. What we didn't know is, just like amphetamine too, there were going to be terrible withdrawal problems from the drug. For all intents and purposes, that makes these drugs very similar to amphetamine in terms of their addictive potential. The main difference is that people don't like the drug enough to take more and more and more of it, because it doesn't make you more and more high. Eventually it just makes you more and more miserable. So people don't go doctor shopping for Prozac. but they have all the problems associated with addiction in terms of you can't get off the drug, even though the drug's bad for you. And it's got stimulating effects. The FDA refused Capit's request to tailor the Prozac label in a way that the stimulation would be shown. And of course, Eli Lilly refused to do it. And this information didn't come out until my 1991 book, Toxic Psychiatry. One of the biggest problems with psychiatric drugs is, they're tested for 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Even the potent antipsychotic drugs, 4, 5, 6 weeks in controlled clinical trials. And you only need 2 for approval. Well, then there's a lot of other lesser trials that we get information from. But it's not anywhere near enough to determine whether a drug is safe before it's put on the market. I myself have been to FDA lectures where they say the drug isn't necessarily safe when it's put on the market. Now there's a movement at the FDA to put a black box warning on all new drugs for 2 or 3 years, saying we don't know exactly what this drug's going to do in the way of adverse effects. It's too new. Well, nowadays, due to drug company propaganda and the gullibility of doctors just grab on to the next thing that comes along. So when Prozac came out, here comes Peter Kramer, a psychiatrist. He should know what he's talking about. He writes a book, Listening to Prozac, as if a pill's going to teach us something. And in it, he gives you 5 or 6 cases of people who look like they're getting high on Prozac, because Prozac does that initially to some people. In the long run, it makes people apathetic. That makes them dull in the long run, if anything. Or it has minimal effects, but it doesn't make you high for long. And so he writes this rhapsody about pharmaceutical cosmetics, or cosmetic he writes this book about cosmetic psychopharmacology, and he actually says, and there's no withdrawal problems from this drug. Well, Kramer's book, along with lots of other cozy drug company kinds of things, Kramer had full cooperation from Eli Lilly. I bet they didn't tell him the stuff I found in their secret files when I was doing product liability work. I'm sure they didn't tell him that the FDA was complaining that the drug was amphetamine-like. Well, physicians are people. We're influenced by our economics, our authority, our interests, and the whole thing now is wrapped around drugs. The FDA has literally gone from watchdog through house pet and into pit bull on behalf of the drug companies. I have stood up at FDA hearings and said, listen, I've seen things you people haven't seen. I've seen studies showing that Prozac causes depression that the drug company hid. I've seen that Paxil suicides are being hidden by GlaxoSmithKline. I got all this stuff. And the FDA has shown no interest. The FDA is much more interested in supporting industry now than it is in monitoring industry. And interestingly enough, I finally found a way to begin to publish some of these inside materials, including Paxil. And my first articles based on my investigations of drug companies came out just a couple weeks before the drug company came out and said Paxil causes suicide. At least I got there a couple of weeks ahead of time, but I've been talking about this stuff for years.